Here's something strange. A president makes an apocalyptic threat about an entire country, then turns his fire toward the Pope, then watches as the question no modern White House wants anywhere near the front page begins moving from whispered private concern into public record, not simply whether he is wrong, not simply whether he is reckless, but whether something about him has changed. And once that question appears in the New York Times, written not as a late-night joke, not as partisan insult, but as a report about former allies, advisors, diplomats, and officials questioning his stability, the story is no longer only about Donald Trump's language. It becomes a story about the system around him. Who sees what? Who says what? Who says what? And who stays quiet? Here's the detail that does not add up. Trump has always used shock as a political instrument. That is not new. He exaggerates. He insults. He dominates attention. His supporters have often explained this as performance, strategy, or plain old Trump being Trump. But the recent concern is different because the people reacting are not only his predictable critics. The Times piece, as summarized by Press Watch, noted that even former allies and advisors were now describing him in language that moved beyond ordinary political criticism, while Peter Baker reported that the president's recent eruptions had raised questions about American leadership in wartime. That is the thread. Not one comment, not one insult, a pattern and the widening circle of people willing to say the pattern out loud. Consider the Iran post. On April 7th, Reuters reported that Trump warned Iran that a whole civilization will die tonight if no agreement was reached to end the conflict. He added that he did not want it to happen, but that it probably would. That sentence landed differently because it was not campaign theater at a rally. It was not a nickname on a debate stage. It was a sitting president speaking in the shadow of war about a country of tens of millions of people using language of civilizational destruction. The old defense that this is just rhetoric begins to buckle when rhetoric is attached to aircraft carriers, missiles, oil prices, alliances, and frightened civilians. And then came the other piece of the puzzle, the debate over diagnosis. This is where the story gets delicate, because no responsible journalist can look at a public figure on television and declare a clinical condition. That is not journalism. That is not medicine. The American Psychiatric Association's Goldwater rule says psychiatrists should not offer a professional opinion about a public figure unless they have conducted an examination and received authorization. The point is not to protect powerful people from scrutiny. The point is to keep medicine from becoming a political weapon. So the serious question is not, is Trump insane? The serious question is, what can the public responsibly evaluate when the observable behavior of a president appears to alarm even some people who once defended him? That distinction matters. A diagnosis belongs to doctors. Fitness for office belongs to the country. Those are not the same thing. A president does not need to be clinically labeled for citizens, lawmakers, military leaders, and foreign governments to assess judgment, impulse control, attention, truthfulness, and decision-making under pressure. Those are public facts. They are visible in statements, orders, personnel choices, briefings, threats, reversals, and the reactions of people inside the system. The paper trail is not a brain scan. It is a record of conduct. The backstory is that America has been here before, but never quite like this. There have been presidents whose health was hidden, presidents whose capacity was questioned, presidents whose aides quietly managed what the public did not fully know. Woodrow Wilson after his stroke, Ronald Reagan after the shooting, and later the Alzheimer's debate after he left office. Joe Biden, whose age and visible frailty became a central issue before he left the stage. But the Trump debate is different because the evidence is not hidden in a medical file. It is broadcast, posted, repeated, defended, clipped, translated, and consumed around the world in real time. That is why the Times article mattered. It was not the first time anyone had raised concerns. Far from it. But there is a difference between concern existing and concern becoming institutionally legible. Once a major newspaper frames the issue as a public debate over presidential stability, the question moves from the fringes into the bloodstream of official Washington. Suddenly, members of Congress get asked about it. Foreign diplomats read it. Military planners absorb it. Markets price it. Allies wonder whether today's threat is policy, impulse, negotiation, or something darker. Now follow the paper trail. The Iran threat was not just condemned by political opponents. Amnesty International responded by warning that threats of large-scale civilian devastation could have catastrophic consequences and pointed to international humanitarian law's prohibition on direct attacks against civilians and civilian objects. That is important because it moves the discussion out of psychology and into legality. You do not need to diagnose a president to ask whether his stated threats are lawful, whether advisors are restraining him, whether cabinet officials are privately alarmed, and whether Congress is functioning as a check or merely watching the performance unfold. Then comes the constitutional shadow. The 25th Amendment is often invoked casually, almost theatrically, whenever people dislike a president. But Section 4 is not a pundit tool. It is a mechanism for inability. It requires the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, or another body Congress may provide, to declare that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of office. If the president disputes that Congress ultimately decides, that is a high bar by design. The Constitution does not remove a president because commentators are alarmed. It requires insiders to act, and that is the revelation. The most important part of this story is not whether a columnist, psychiatrist, former aide, or political opponent has found the right adjective for Trump. The most important part is that the system depends on people closest to power being honest about what they see. If those people normalize everything, nothing happens. If they leak concern but refuse responsibility, nothing happens. If they privately fear instability but publicly perform loyalty, the country is left with theater where accountability should be. This is the uncomfortable truth hiding inside the mental health debate. America has built a presidency with enormous destructive capacity, but the safeguards around that capacity still rely heavily on human courage. Cabinet officials must be willing to confront the president. Lawmakers must be willing to put country above party. Advisors must be willing to tell the truth before the crisis, not in a memoir 2 years later. The machinery exists, but machinery does not move itself. And here is the part that should concern all of us. This is happening during a live foreign policy crisis, not in a quiet political season. Reuters reported that 77% of registered voters in one recent Reuters/Ipsos poll said Trump bore at least a fair amount of responsibility for rising gasoline prices after his decision to launch war on Iran alongside Israel, and 58% said they were less likely to support midterm candidates who backed his approach to the conflict. That means the debate over judgment is now fused with war, inflation, oil, elections, and control of Congress. It is not abstract. It is kitchen table politics meeting nuclear age risk. Notice the trap here. If critics use sloppy language, Trump's defenders can dismiss the whole debate as hysteria. If journalists avoid the subject entirely, the public is denied a serious discussion of observable conduct. The narrow path is the only responsible one. Do not diagnose from afar, but do not pretend that repeated extreme statements by the commander-in-chief are merely entertainment. Do not confuse clinical certainty with civic responsibility. And do not let the word mental health become a shield against examining power. So when people ask, is Trump really insane? The answer, journalistically, is that this is the wrong question. The better question is whether the president's public conduct shows patterns that raise legitimate concerns about judgment, restraint, and fitness in moments of consequence. That question can be answered with evidence. It can be tested against decisions. It can be measured against who is warning, who is enabling, who is resigning, who is silent, and who is pretending the abnormal is normal because admitting otherwise would cost them power. There are still open questions. What are current cabinet officials saying privately? Are military and intelligence leaders receiving clear, consistent orders, or are they interpreting mood, impulse, and social media posts as policy signals? And perhaps most important, are Republican lawmakers privately worried in ways they are not yet willing to say publicly? The country does not need amateur diagnosis. It needs adult accountability.